Good evening all, and welcome. Today's video has been graciously sponsored by The Rich Wallet. They were very kind to send me one of these beauties, and even though it's not a word I typically use to define a wallet, its elegance and simplicity really speaks for itself. For too long have I been hefting around my thick leather wallet, and now that I have the Rich Wallet, it's changed the feel of my pocket completely. I guess I never really noticed how bulky and in the way it was until now. It's great, all you do is just slot your cards in and put your cash in your money strap. It's literally changed my life. And that's it, you're all set. There's no need for anything else. It's super durable and comes with a lifetime guarantee. So, if you're interested in getting one of your very own, or for someone else, be sure to punch in the promo code Mortis for 10% off. The link can be found in the description. So go on, liberate your pockets today. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This happened a long time ago, before cell phones were prevalent, and I was a mum in my early 30s who had just driven our kids to the pediatrician. The Macon, Georgia doctor's office was an hour away from our home, and I was taking the two youngest of my three, then ages 1 and 3, to our scheduled appointment. Because we lived so far away, their office always gave us the last 2 appointments of the day, and we were grateful. The doctor had just built a new building off a fresh spur of the highway, so the location was quite isolated in every direction, but a very nice facility compared to his old spot by the hospital there. His new building was also pretty far back on the new lot, and my car, a black Jeep we had owned for 2 years, was one of only 4 or 5 cars in the parking lot when we got there. I parked near the front door, removed the kids from their car seats, and for the next hour or so we waited, then saw the doctor, paid, and finally exited back outside. Mine was the only car left in the lot, as I loaded the children in their car seats for our trip home. But as the receptionist locked the front glass doors, my car somehow wouldn't start when I turned the key. There was just an odd clicking noise. Gathering the children once again, I knocked on the door until someone allowed us back in and asked to borrow their phone to call a nearby garage for service. I found one in the phone book, and the man said that he would come, but that it might take a little bit, so I told him my location. I left to go back out to the car, rolled down all the windows and loaded the children back into their seats once more as we waited. As soon as we watched, all the lights were turned out in the building, and again everyone left, their cars departing one by one from behind the building somewhere, leaving us now completely alone in the parking lot. As it was still light, I spent a lot of that time trying to tend to the children, digging through our car for snacks, and a bottle, making sure that they weren't getting too hot. Although the service station attendant said that it was probably going to take quite a while, I was pleasantly surprised when a truck pulled into the empty parking lot, and a man got out of his pickup, smiled, nodded at me, and said that he was going to raise the hood. He was middle-aged and a bit scruffy, but quite frankly, many gas station attendants sometimes looked that way, especially at the end of the day. And I was grateful when he began doing something under the hood almost immediately. I sat down again in the driver's seat with the door open, waiting for him to tell me to try the engine. But he seemed to be taking a long time checking the connections, and I longed for him to just grab the jump starter cables, yet he never did. Without getting out of the car, I asked him what he thought was wrong, and he said, "Oh, it's just a loose wire, not the battery," and continued whatever he was doing. I couldn't see his face at all from where I was sitting, but his hands were slightly visible through the long horizontal slits between the windshield and the raised hood. More than once, he said it was merely a loose wire, and if I would just come up here real quick, he could show me which one it was, so it would never happen again. I remember kind of smiling and shaking my head, saying that sadly there was no reason to show me anything, as I didn't know anything about cars, and just thanked him and continued to stay in the driver's seat, again just waiting for the inevitable signal to try to start the ignition that was most surely going to come at any moment. At one point, I remember thinking that he was definitely flirting as he spoke, but I was trying above all else to be polite and kind, as he was indeed helping us. We were hot, tired, and miserable, and truthfully, I was distracted with the two young kids. Oddly enough, he was starting to sound a little more frustrated with me, because I wouldn't come up to look at the engine. I remember thinking that I certainly didn't want to make him mad when he left us there all alone, with the sun sinking so quickly. And then the strangest thing happened. Another truck suddenly pulled into that desolate parking lot, and as it did, the nice guy working underneath my hood suddenly slammed it shut, ran to his truck, started it, and drove away very quickly without even saying goodbye. I was both confused and a little anxious when he did this, because I didn't know who was now arriving. I even remember feeling a little frightened that he had suddenly left me alone with two little ones defenseless. Why wouldn't he at least stay and speak to whoever was parking next to me now? It certainly seemed the southern gentlemanly thing to do. I looked around and was very aware once again there were no visible cars on the road, nor homes or businesses nearby, and the sun was continuing to set quickly. As this new, unmarked pickup pulled up next to me, I got out of the car once again, this time more apprehensive. Upon exiting though, he immediately introduced himself, and his name and voice seemed to match who I had spoken to on the phone earlier. He then actually called me by name, apologized for being so late, and finally smiled and stared towards the road, pointing and asking who the man was that had just left so suddenly. Relieved and unfazed, I smiled back in surprise and told him, "Well, I dunno. I thought all this time he was you." And we both laughed slightly. And then he grabbed the jumper cables, walked in front of my car, raised the hood, and started to work. I immediately sat back in the driver's seat once more, suddenly grateful that, with luck, the air conditioner would be blowing full blast shortly, and once again checking the children. While listening for the familiar words, "Try it," I had my back completely turned towards the children, when he surprised me by suddenly coming to the driver's side door. In the strangest voice he said, "Ma'am, is this yours?" And when I looked into his hand, he was holding a long, thin, dagger-like looking device that was about 1.5 feet in length. It appeared to be very old and covered with reddish dust. Yet, on one end, it had tiny circular small finger holes. It was as if it was a mix of a long thin sword and scissors oddly combined. I remember being amazed but not frightened, and I asked where he had found them. "Under the hood," he replied. I said, just matter-of-factly, that I'd never seen them before, but how weird it was that those things had somehow been stuck and undiscovered in my car for all those years, and shook my head in surprise. He continued to stand there and stare at them, unbelievingly, and he looked oddly pale too, like he couldn't find the right words to speak for a bit and just continued to stare at the unusual object. Honestly, I didn't care about it one bit. All I could think about was getting the car going, letting me pay him the cost, and leaving. He didn't say anything else, just quickly set them up on the curb, started his truck, and then signaled me to start the Jeep. And when it immediately caught, my 3-year-old cheered. Gratefully, I turned on the air conditioning in full blast, rolled up the windows, armed the air vents back towards the back seat, and reached for my purse to pay out. I stood up and took a few steps to meet him so that I could hear the amount I owed. With both of our vehicles running, he came back around to my driver's side, but instead of handing me the bill, irritated me a bit by walking right past me and picking up the weird object once more. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I want you to look at these one more time," and held them out for closer inspection. This time I moved a bit closer and actually really looked. In his hands, the item still appeared to be incredibly large, possessing an almost bayonet-looking quality, except for the strangely small 2 loops on the end. I'd never seen anything like it, and I told him so. As he held it, he spoke quietly and slowly to me, as if trying desperately to make me understand something that was somehow still going over my head. "These weren't hidden somewhere in the engine, ma'am. They hadn't been there very long at all, because they were sitting right on top. They must have just been put there." I shook my head and said no, and half smiled as I said, "But they're obviously very old and rusty." To which he pointed more closely and replied, "Yeah, but see how sharp they are? These look like they've just been sharpened." And when I looked down, he was right. The long, skinny dagger-like shape was unusual, but by far the oddest quality was just how sharp it appeared to be. The edges at the tip were where the rust had been removed and were gleaming silver. As I paid him, his final words to me were, "Ma'am, I don't know what was about to happen here, but I'm really glad I pulled up when I did." He quietly thanked me when taking the payment, told me that I probably needed to call the police when I got home, and then asked me where I wanted them. I didn't want to touch it, didn't want to take it at all, but I released the back window so he could place it inside. We both then left the lot together, him turning one way and me turning the other, towards the small winding highway that would lead me home, still an hour away. I did indeed contact the Macon police the moment that we arrived home, and I got the children safely inside. But although they listened politely, they declined when I offered to bring the scissor-like things to them later. The officer I spoke to said that they sounded as if they were specialized surgical shears from my description and measurements over the phone, which I found quite disturbing, as you can imagine. I remember wondering how he could even know that, why he would even say that. I had tried so carefully not to touch any of the surfaces, hoping they may be able to lift prints or test for blood if they wanted, but the story seemed to bore him a bit, and he didn't seem interested. His attitude insinuated as there was no longer an emergency, it was of no importance now. At the very end of the call, as if to wind things up, he did say it sounded as if I was very lucky, and that I might want to keep the shears for a few days, just in case someone from his office got back with me later. But that was all. I wrapped them carefully in newspaper, placed them in the brick storage unit behind our house, and they remained there for several more years untouched, until we moved away, and I finally, not wanting to bring them across several states, reluctantly threw them in the trash. Around that time though, if you look through old news reports, women were going missing all over Georgia. Some bodies were eventually found, but others remain missing to this very day. I have often wondered what would have happened if the service station attendant hadn't arrived when he did, if my children would still have a mother, if I still would have had my son and daughter, if I would have missed all these years with them. I guess I'll never know, but I learned something very important about myself that day. I've always felt that I was pretty aware of my surroundings, pretty good at reading people, and staying safe. But because I was exhausted and tired and hot and stranded in a different city, my common sense and intelligence simply left me for a bit and wasn't working at that time. and many of my friends and family still think that our car trouble that day and my lack of awareness could have easily cost us our lives. I'm a 22-year-old guy from South Africa, and this incident happened about 2 years ago. You must understand that South Africa has been notorious for having a high crime rate, especially at night. I'm a 6-foot-tall guy, relatively big, and I'm a complete introvert. I was never a big fan of going to clubs and parties. My friends always knocked me for being so antisocial and for being such an introvert. So this one time I decided to tag along with them. When we got to the club, it was better than I expected it to be. The vibe and music was amazing, but I never danced or socialized with anyone. My friends went off to socialize and chat up people, being the social butterflies they were. As for me, I just stood there awkwardly and alone until this one girl came up to me. She was petite, attractive, and hit me up with a, "Hey, I'm Chelsea." In my head, I was filled with confusion. I mean, it's not like I was the most attractive bloke. I went with the flow and introduced myself nonetheless. We were then sat at the counter over a few drinks. We had an awesome conversation going, and after a few drinks I noticed the conversation started to feel a bit awkward. She kept on glancing a few times at something or someone behind me, and started to speak less and seemed less interested in what I was saying now. With me being in such a tipsy state, I didn't even bother to turn around and to see who it was she was looking at. And after a few more drinks, I had an incredible buzz going for me, and then decided to go out for a cigarette and excused myself from the girl I was chatting to. As I was outside, I could feel my legs being hard to move. My head became heavy, and I became lightheaded and dizzy. I thought it was just the alcohol. I brushed the uneasy feeling off and went outside, lit my cigarette, and started to browse through my phone. Then I could hear footsteps approaching me. Another guy was coming towards me. He introduced himself as Craig and tried to bum me a cigarette. Reluctantly, I reached for my pocket and gave him one. My vision then started to get really blurry. I was losing my balance and couldn't stand straight. Then I saw 2 more silhouettes walking towards me and felt a blow to the back of my head. I woke up to the faces of my friends a few hours later, only to realize I was in a hospital bed, and according to them, one of them had seen me going outside when I went for a smoke. They proceeded to go out and join me. When they eventually got there, they saw 3 men holding me as if I were passed out drunk and walking to a nearby truck in the parking lot. My friend then called out the guys. They turned around, dropped me, and fled in their truck. According to the medical, I had some drug substance in my body and was in shock. Then it hit me. That girl, Chelsea, she kept on dropping a few of her belongings towards my side of the chair. Me being in a buzzed and happy state, I was happy to pick them up, thinking it was gentleman's etiquette. I was really oblivious to the fact that she was purposefully doing that to distract me. She then probably threw something in my drink, and then began to signal the guys behind me that her objective had been completed. From what I've heard, there were incidences where an attractive girl is used to lure lonely and vulnerable-looking guys into a trap, so the guys can take them somewhere to do who knows what. Their intentions weren't to rob me because they never took any of my belongings. They clearly had something much more sinister planned. I'm glad my friends saw me leaving at the time, and it scares me to know what could have happened if they didn't. Stay safe, people, and be very careful at clubs and parties. Don't lose sight of your drink, and be cautious of strangers who come across as too friendly. You never know what their real intentions might be. Back in 2007, I found myself working as a bartender at a now closed pub in my hometown. Not a job I particularly liked, but it paid the bills. At this time, they had hired a new kitchen manager that we all simply knew as Kearney. Kearney was a pleasant enough guy, mostly keeping to himself, but always stayed late to help the barman do our closing duties, so we all liked him for that. New in town, Kearney had yet to find a place of permanent residence, and I had recently lost my tenants, so someone suggested he asked me. He was considerably older than the tenants I usually took in, but having a streak of bad luck with tenants my own age, I thought an older man with a nice steady job may be a shift in the right direction, so I agreed. Kearney wasted no time and followed me home that very same night, only he wasn't alone. Enter Lawrence, the boyfriend of Kearney. Honestly, I hadn't even recognized he was gay up to that point, but was water off my back regardless. Looking back now, what really should have bothered me though was Lawrence's appearance. He looked like he had been sleeping on the streets, rather appropriately as I would find out later. Kearney moved in. Lawrence was there a lot too, and it was easy to know when due to his mobile ringtone sounding like the quacking of a duck. Kearney had some habits that were rather noteworthy to this story. In particular, he basically never closed his bedroom door no matter what he was doing in there. It was always open, and although he was a heavy smoker, he never once smoked inside the house. After Kearney had been living there for about 2 weeks, I had come down with an awful case of pink eye. This being highly contagious, I was given leave of absence from my bartending job, and therefore decided to go wait it out at my sister's for a few days. Apparently I didn't mind giving it to her. The day my sister was scheduled to come pick me up, I took a casual stroll into the bar that myself and Ben, a good friend from high school, at the time, co-worker, had been building in my house. And something caught my eye. All our liquor bottles were completely empty. Now, those who had been frequenting my house at the time would know that we weren't just talking about 1 or 2 bottles of brandy here, but bottles of whiskey, gin, vodka, snaps, liqueurs. Basically, it was a fully stocked bar that could host pretty big parties without requiring much in the way of additions. So I called Kearney in, asking him what he knew about this, receiving feedback that Lawrence and he had been on a slight drinking binge. Those were the actual words he used, and had left me both furious about the thousands worth of stock they had drunk out, but also slightly impressed that he was actually still alive. Regardless, I said that I would be dealing with this upon my return. So I'm with my sister for a few days, and on Friday I get a call from my local police department, asking me if I know Conrad Schultz. Ironically, even though I didn't, they finally add that I will probably know him as Kearney, and that I should probably come down to the station, as they had just arrested his boyfriend, trying to sell my camera equipment. So my sister rushes me back home where all my camera equipment was on display at the police station. It's on this visit that I am informed that Lawrence was actually a Navy SEAL, who got dishonorably discharged before turning to a life of crime, and now had a rap sheet the length of the Bible. The kicker was that both he and Kearney were actually homeless men who had met at the Salvation Army. So Lawrence is in jail, and my sister drops me off at home more or less at the same time that Kearney gets home as well. Based on Kearney's accounts of what happened, he had turned Lawrence in himself, as he couldn't allow Lawrence to do what he was trying to do. Although I had appreciated his sacrifice, I still told Kearney that he would have to go, having been the overall cause of this. However, not wanting to leave the homeless man, well, homeless, I gave him until the end of the month to make another arrangement. Monday comes, and after having completing staff meetings, I walk home to encounter a very much free Lawrence sitting on the sidewalk across my house watching it. I confront Lawrence as to why he's there, and he tries to apologize before begging for money. Rather out of character, really. I dismissed him without giving him a cent. Now, I go back to the previous night. See, I had mentioned the staff meeting for a reason, as it was at this meeting where we had gotten a rather sizable list of liquor bottles that had gone missing from the storeroom, leaving us all suspecting each other. I, however, would not have to wait long to figure out who the real culprit was, as a few days later, I opened the garbage bin in my kitchen to see the missing bottles all empty and staring back at me. I decided to sit on this information for the time being, although I did photograph it all just in case, as I needed it for evidence later. I'd also called over Ben to inform him of the developments, as this was quickly becoming a detective game. We decided to enter Kearney's room to search for further evidence. Nothing of vast significance in there, with one exception, 2 single photographs of Lawrence. Before he had turned into the homeless version of Lex Luthor, actually there were several of Lawrence's things still there. But as Lawrence had spent a lot of time there before the incident, I accepted this as normal. Now I should also add that I had mentioned Lawrence's release to Kearney, and had told him that if I even suspected that they were still seeing each other, I would throw him out of the house myself. Only a few days would pass before this came into play. On this particular night, I had been bartending again, and Kearney had constantly been stopping by the bar to help himself to draft glasses half full of wine and half full of Coke, which he would go drink outside the restaurant. We confronted him about this, but, as he correctly pointed out, he was still a manager, and we had no right to tell him what he could or couldn't do. On his 4th trip, however, I had grown suspicious and decided to follow him outside, where I encountered Lawrence sitting out sharing the half-Coke, half-wine concoction. This annoyed me, so the next day I returned to the restaurant with photographic evidence that I handed over to the general manager, who was also a friend of mine. Although I hadn't physically seen it, I had heard the confrontation through the office door when he fired Kearney. Kearney left obviously upset, and apparently had no idea that I had been the one who turned him in. So we had closed early that night and I was walking home. Going past the high school, I saw Kearney coming from the opposite direction. He walked past me, literally only saying 2 words, "I'm scared," before disappearing into the darkness. That would be the last time that I would ever physically lay my eyes on Comrade Schultz. So we reached the final week before Kearney's eviction was to take place. Ben had come to stay with me for that duration, as we both wanted to monitor the situation and make sure nothing else happened. It was in this week that Kearney's behavior suddenly changed. He was constantly smoking in his room, and his door was closed 24/7. In fact, neither Ben nor I had caught so much as a peek of him in that entire week, which we hadn't thought much of at the time. The day of Kearney's eviction comes around. Ben had got home for a few hours, and I finally hear Kearney's bedroom door open. Someone walks out the room, opens the front door and leaves. I follow him outside, but somehow he's already completely vanished. What was left, though, were his house keys, indicating he obviously wasn't planning on returning. I look at the keys and notice something strange. Although the correct keys were on the keychain, there were also several that weren't mine. Why would he leave me all the wrong keys? His room was a shock, not because of the state it was in. The 2 had broken his bed in an act of wild monkeyness, but I had already known about that. As I said, he never closed his doors. But more than that, he had literally left almost all his belongings behind, with one exception, the 2 photos of Lawrence. Upon further investigation, I suddenly realized that all traces of Lawrence ever being there had completely vanished, with all of Kearney's stuff left behind. There was one thing of Lawrence's left behind though, his duckling ringtone, which it turned out hadn't so much been a ringtone as an actual duckling, which now strolled around casually in the vacant bedroom. We called him Neville. So Ben returned and gets updated about the developments, both of us thinking the way he left was rather weird, of course. and the whole thing had been very strange. It was only when I asked the infamous question that this all becomes a conspiracy theory. Did you ever actually see Kearney in this week? It was to our shock that we realized neither of us had, and suddenly started putting puzzle pieces together. The changing habits, Neville the duck, the wrong keys, only Lawrence's stuff being gone. It was to great discomfort that we both asked the question, who had really been living in our house this last week? During the last few days, Ben and I went on a mission, searching the town, crawling into drainpipes, trying to find any trace of Kearney's whereabouts, but they all added up to nothing. Comrade Schultz had simply vanished off the face of the earth. This wasn't the case with Lawrence, though. He was still around, having made some new homeless friends. We encountered him several times, begging on the streets, and every time I asked him, "Where's Kearney?" but he just acted like he'd never heard of him. The last time I would see Lawrence was across from work, attempting to break into a car. I called the police on him, and they arrived rather quickly, arresting him on the spot. While he was being led away by police, I shouted at him one last time, "Where's Kearney, Lawrence?" But he ignored me and let the cops drag him away. The next day I filed a missing persons report, as I thought Kearney was missing, and suggested that Lawrence may know something about it, but never came of it. So Lawrence, I don't know if you did something to Kearney or not, but if you did, let's not meet again. For those of you wondering what happened to Neville the duck, we kept him for quite a while, but due to the malnourishment he received his first few months, he never grew and ultimately passed away. For those of you wondering what happened to the case, unfortunately, South Africa has a very unique way of closing cases, as in after a month or two, they just send you a text saying, "Case closed due to lack of evidence," or "Case closed with no arrests." I didn't get one in this case, but did get one in an armed robbery I fell victim to in 2017, so not too helpful that they did much effort here. Regarding Lawrence, I saw him one more time after getting arrested. He was only locked up for about a week. After that, though, he disappeared. I'm not sure if he left town or got arrested again. This event happened 20 years ago, when I was 9 years old. My family took a ski trip to West Virginia, a ski resort. My dad really wanted to get his money worth, so he had my whole family come out on the slopes about 20 minutes before the lifts were even running. It was something like 15 degrees and around lunchtime. My mum and I were getting too cold to have fun, so we decided to get hot chocolate at the food hall while my dad and brother and I stayed out for a few more advanced runs, and all agreed to meet for lunch about an hour later. My mum and I got our hot chocolate and were warming up in the food hall when I got a second wind. The kiddie slope was right outside the building, so I asked my mum if I could do a few runs while waiting for my dad and brother to return. My mum was usually extremely cautious about letting my brother and I do things on our own, but from where she was sitting she had a view of the slopes through the window and probably for that reason said okay. At first everything was fine. I was thrilled to be out on my own, and I felt invincible, blasting down an easy slope after the trickier ones I'd been on with my parents. I went down a few times and was feeling good when I started to notice myself passing a specific man over and over. This man was very distinctive looking in the crowd of skiing families, wearing 90s style snow gear. Tall, wearing what appeared to be a black trench coat, not a ski jacket, with a long dark beard and dark-rimmed glasses, and a black hat with a rim. As a 9-year-old, his appearance kind of scared me a bit like a cartoon villain, and I began to feel like I was seeing him everywhere. It wasn't a huge slope, but it still seemed like we passed each other more often than I was passing other skiers. I also started getting the sense that he was trying to get on the lift with me, like waiting to get in line until after I did. Even though we never ended up being put on a lift together, I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if he really was showing up way too often, so I decided to test him. The next time I got off the lift, I went back down the slopes like normal, knowing he had been on a few chairs behind me and would probably come right down the slope as well. When I was about halfway down the hill, I stopped suddenly and the man passed me. That's when it started getting weird. After passing me, the man went a little way further down the hill and gently fell down in a controlled way. He sat on the ground and watched me pass him, and then immediately got back up and skied the rest of the way down the hill, getting in line for the lift, several people behind me. I don't know what he said, but he spoke to each of the people that were in line between him and me, and managed to get right behind me as I was about to go on the lift. Right as the chair came around, he got up beside me and tried to get on the lift with me. At the last second, I played dumb and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead," and stepped back to let him on. He seemed surprised by what I said, but got on alone, and I got on the next lift with a mum and her daughter instead. They were really nice, and I had a good chat with them on the way up the hill. For some reason, I was too stupid and shaken up to tell them about the man. I was hoping it would look like they were my family, or at least someone else on the slope that was paying attention to me. At this point, I felt pretty sure that this creepy man had singled me out, and years of my parents saying stranger danger and that training told me that it was probably time to find my mum. I resolved to ski back down to the food hall as soon as I got to the top. Instead, I got off the lift, said goodbye to the mum and daughter, and was immediately approached by the man who clearly waited for me at the top. He came right over to me and said, "Are you all alone, little girl?" It's funny to think back now, but at the time I remember being kind of insulted at this question because it sounded so much like all the cheesy lines my parents would come up with when they taught my brother and I about stranger danger. I couldn't believe this guy could think of a less obvious question to ask, or that he actually referred to me as little girl instead of pretending to know me, or something less conspicuous. I think his audacity in that regard kept me from being as afraid as I otherwise may have been. It made it seem like a game or simulation, which probably helped me act more natural. I answered him in a very matter-of-fact way, saying that I wasn't all alone, and pointed to a nearby man and his teenage son, saying that that was my dad and brother. Then I walked away very casually, as if I wasn't at all weirded out by his question, and skied down the hill to the food hall where I quickly found my mum. I told her all about the guy and the weirdness, and while I was telling her, I saw him come inside and start walking around with his head high, clearly scanning the crowd like he was looking for someone. My mum was really freaked out and didn't let me leave again, even to get food. My dad and brother arrived soon after that, and my mum told my dad the story. He brushed it off as someone probably being awkward but trying to look out for me, but my mum wasn't too convinced and neither was I. I think about that guy every now and then, and wonder what was really going on with him, why he was dressed so unusually and unseasonably while skiing. Why was he only skiing on the kiddie slopes when he didn't seem to be with a family? Why did he notice me at all? All that I do know is that I never want to see him again. This takes place in a very small town in western Kentucky, as in one flashing caution light, blink, and you'll miss it. There is a 2-lane highway that runs between this town and a large college town about 15 minutes away. At the time this story takes place, the highway was shut down for a few days for repaving in the very small town. Also, I was 20 years old and 4 months pregnant. I was working in a convenience store that only sold tobacco products and lottery tickets. I normally worked the day shift, but due to another employee's scheduling conflict, I was closing that day by myself. One of my regular customers had left about 5 minutes prior to closing. After I saw him pull out of the parking lot, I walked over to the door to lock it. It's also important to note that there were absolutely no other vehicles besides my own in the parking lot. Before I could turn the lock, 2 armed men, dressed in all black, including full face masks, rushed the door and pushed it open, ordering me back to the register area to empty it, as well as the separate lottery machine and register. I emptied both of these into a plastic bag. The guy carried a shotgun, ordered me to the back room where the safe was, and had me empty this as well. At this point, I began hyperventilating and was trying to cover my pregnant belly with one arm, all the while trying to throw the cash and rolled coins into the bag. The man grew impatient and pushed me backwards into the wall, grabbing the cash that I had dropped. The second man came into the back room, aiming his firearm at me, and shouted at me to stay back there and slammed the door shut while they ran out the front door. I had fallen to the ground after hitting the wall, so when I heard the front door close, I crawled to the door to the back room and cracked it open to be sure they were gone. After confirming this, I ran to the front door, locked it, then ran back to the counter where our phone is. My hands were shaking so badly, I could hardly dial, but managed to call the owner of the store, who called the police. Due to the shut-down highway, it took them about 20 minutes to arrive, along with an ambulance. I gave my statement. The police called in their K9 units to attempt to track the men, since they'd obviously fled on foot. But as far as I know, they were never caught. I was in shock, so my boss called my now ex-husband and asked me to come pick me up. There was no way I would be able to drive myself. The jerk was with his friends playing video games and refused. Thankfully, his son was able to drive me home, and I sat in our empty house for 3 hours before he came home. I was jumping at every little sound and was a nervous wreck when he did finally return. Ultimately, I had to go to the hospital because of the stress, causing me to go into early labor. Thankfully, they were able to stop the contractions, and my daughter made her appearance 4 months later. Fun fact: when my daughter was 3, I was speaking about this to her preschool teacher and she said, "Yeah, I heard the whole thing." It was scary. She's now 12 and insists that she remembers this. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's stories. I know I said that we were going to do more nature themed, but I'm going to be honest, I miscategorized the first story, and I had it under cabins for some reason. Pretty silly of me, to be honest. So I read it, and when I was thinking, I know I've read this, but what has it got to do with cabins? And then I reached the end and was like, oh, nothing to do with cabins. So I changed the video, and I just did Let's Not Me instead. I hope you liked it. If you did, you know what to do. Hopefully there'll be cabin stories tomorrow. Oh no, there won't be. There won't be because tomorrow's a compilation. That's right. Hopefully there'll be cabin stories soon. So, you know, look out for those. Yeah, Monday's my birthday. Don't expect a video because there won't be one. But, you know, rewatch something old if you want to. I've got over 1,000 videos after all. Yeah, and tomorrow we've got a comp, so I'll be seeing you on Tuesday, I suppose. Tuesday night, with cabin stories. Look out then. Well, I'm going to wish you all a wonderful night. Thank you all, my lovely patrons, for your incredible support. It really does mean a lot. And yeah, just thank you. You guys are amazing. If you want to join the Patreon squad and have your name at the end, and you know, now on screen, you can find the link in the description. Alright then. It's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.